Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to share a little story. Um, as I'm tearing this library apart, and some of the stuff will stay here just to the end. I'm moving on April the 16th, to be exact. That's the date of the move. So it's been a slow process with all of the other stuff that's been going on has kind of interrupted some of the packing and the moving, but I'm back to work here and pulling out more stuff and, of course, finding stuff and remembering dear friends that are long gone. I have mentioned Franco Corelli and Robert Merrill and Jerome Hines. I was very good friends with Jerome Hines and knew Franco Corelli and Robert Merrill. All of them used to, we used to sit and chit-chat and talk about stuff. And one of the things that Corelli would do is, he would sit there and say, like, he'd grab my business card and he'd just sign it. And I was working in the 1990s. I was working for the Barnes & Noble book company, and I was doing community events for them, setting up with personalities and great writers and whatever else, and setting it up at stores and stuff like that. It was an interesting job back when Barnes & Noble was really a big thing. Sad to see that bookstores are slowly on their way out. But I found my business card and happened to look on the other side, and Franco had signed it. Franco Corelli, New York, 1998. It wasn't in New York, but that's all right. He just automatically wrote New York wherever he was. If he was in Minneapolis, it would be New York. Don't ask me. I can't explain that. But what I wanted to show you was something that I have had for the last 20 years that I just don't talk about much, and it's been with me. And it's something Jerome Hines gave me. And I have to explain, these singers, Robert Merrill and Jerry Hines and Franco Corelli, they all started in the old Met. In fact, Jerome Hines sang the last note on stage at the old Met, because the last thing performed on the stage of the Met was the final scene from Faust. And of course, the last words, Mephistopheles says, condemned to Faust. But Jerry told me in that gala performance, at the end, instead of condemning Faust, he turned to the audience, raised his hands and spread it out to the house and said, condemned. I thought that was interesting. And of course, he fought to save the old house, but Rudolph Bing said, if we don't destroy this opera house, another opera company will move in. That's kind of unfortunate. That building should have been preserved. And I take my hat off to Jerry for trying to save it. But Rudolph Bing was not an easy person to deal with. But I'm getting away from the story, as is my wont at times. To answer the question, I know I've had people say this before, there's a jug right behind me, and that's iced tea, just so you know. A couple of people read it back. What's in that jug? Iced tea. Nothing more, nothing less. One time I was talking to Jerry, and he knew I had a fascination with some of the early opera singers. And, one day he handed me this, which I'll pull out in a second, but let me explain it to you. He started in the 1940s at the old Met, and under Johnson, who was the manager at the time. And he got to meet a lot of the old singers, and he knew Geraldine Farrar and Francis Alda, and he had a voice lesson with Titta Ruffo, which wasn't exactly a voice lesson. It was more of a therapy gathering, because he told me an interesting story, and that was that he took a bicycle trip to Europe. He got time off from the manager, Edward Johnson, and went through Italy after the war, short time after the war. And he said he found his way to the home of Titta Ruffo. And he met Titta Ruffo, and Titta Ruffo gave him a voice lesson, which was, the thing about Titta Ruffo was that, as the old sewing was, and Jerry used to tell me, he said that someone came up to him one time and said, Maestro, I've listened to all of your records and I've learned to emulate how you sing. And he said, Titta Ruffo looked at him and said, then you've learned nothing. But it was an emotional gathering. And he told me a story that Titta Ruffo told him, which I want to share with you. And that was that Titta Ruffo, after he retired, he wrote his autobiography, and he talked about his life. And this was during the reign of El Duce Mussolini. And he was not exactly too fond of Mussolini, and stated so in his autobiography. And he was jailed. He was put into prison for his outlandish comments that he had made about El Duce. And the American ambassador to Italy went to see Mussolini and said, how would it look to Mussolini if Italy's greatest baritone dies in prison under your watch? And that made Mussolini think, and Titta Ruffo was released from prison with the adage, no more books. And he said he sat there with Ruffo, and Ruffo had a large portrait over the fireplace of him as Hamlet. And on the table in front of the portrait was the big sword that he wore in Hamlet. And Titta Ruffo looked at Hines and said, sometimes I hold the sword and I can feel the voice coming back. And then it's gone. And then he cried. And they cried together. It was an amazing gathering for Hines to meet the great Titta Ruffo. He was an amazing singer. As Tony Randall once told me, he said the greatest baritone he ever heard in his life. And he said he liked Ruffo better than he liked Caruso. Interesting. But Jerry knew that I was fond of Caruso and that whole gang. So one day when I went to his house, he presented me with this piece. He said many of his dressmakers and many of the makeup, many of the people there had worked with Caruso, and there were pieces of Caruso stuff all over the place still, and some of them had it at home and the like. And he said his dressmaker gave him this. I've had this for so many years now. This was Caruso's belt. And it's beautiful. It's very old and very, very fragile. But as you can see, it's kind of like a green velvet. And I've had this all these years. It's a big, good-sized belt. He wasn't a monstrous guy, but he wasn't skinny either. But he said, you should have this. And I have for the last 20 some odd years I've had this. And I thought I would share this with you. As I'm going to the library, I'm taking this. I had this put away in a safe spot, but I wanted to bring it out. And you don't get to see Caruso's belts very often. And I was very honored when Jerry gave that to me. Interesting thing. I have to figure out what to do with that eventually, because it needs to be put into a safe situation. I'm not quite sure what to do yet. But it was interesting finding, Corelli's autograph on my business card. Interesting. He was an interesting guy. He told me so many stories too, and I need to add a lot more information. So, I guess you might call this, as we tear apart the library, the things that I'm digging up. This is about all I need to say. I can end this with thanks of all the kind messages that I have received with the passing of my mom. She passed away 5 days ago. Also, thank you for your support and joining this channel, and I hope you find some of the stuff I talk about interesting, and please subscribe. Would appreciate that. I hope to eventually, when I get to Chicago, I've talked to people in Chicago and want to do like dual broadcasts with some folks there, and talking about history and Broadway history and theatrical history and, Chicago history. There's so much history there. And that's about all I wanted to say. If you have comments, please say something. I think I'd like to hear your ideas of maybe what we should do with Caruso's belt. Amazing that Caruso will be in just 4 more years, 150 years old. Amazing. So that's it. Thank you so much.